Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friend Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, joining you from a different location from usual, because unfortunately, the city of Johannesburg's electricity infrastructure is not really that great, and something blew up in my house, losing me power. So I had to flee to another undisclosed location in order to continue broadcasting. But the signal of liberty never dies, and joining me today on that signal are Sara. Sara, how are things?
Hi, Nick. No, well, and you?
Yeah, not too bad, not too bad. I do apologize if I fall off the call or anything like that, or the podcast, because, like I said, different environment, different tech, might not be as stable as at home. And we're also, of course, joined by Mr. Michael Morris. Michael, how are you doing?
All good, thank you. Pleased to say that in Cape Town, such events are pretty rare. And if something, I mean, a couple of weeks ago, we got a very nice note in the letterbox to say your power is going to be cut off next Wednesday from 9 a.m. to 3 for routine infrastructure upgrade, whatever it might have been. And so you had a kind of week's preparation. It was a bit annoying, but you realize, this is what cities are meant to do time to time. And yeah, so that's generally how it goes in the Cape. I'm pleased to say.
I think in Joburg we're going to start getting notices saying, "Oh, you've got power for the next 12 and a half hours."
Yes, but yesterday's fun began with an explosion at a local substation, which burst open with a loud crash, and lots of smoke poured out of it. So anyway, I think it may actually be fixed, but I'm probably going to be here for a while. Anyway, so let us get into the news, and we're going to start off, of course, with a theme we've been talking about for a while on the Daily Friend Show, but one that I think is getting worse. And there have been a lot of stories about this in the past couple of weeks. So the latest is that the National Freedom Party, that's the little party that split away from the IFP, it's not been doing well for a while now. I think it's basically sort of a regional party focused mostly now around a couple of northern KZN municipalities. It still continues to exist though, and the National Freedom Party has called for changes in legislation around elections, saying that the country needs to do away with by-elections after a councillor was murdered. This is one of their proposed preventative measures. The party says it believes halt the recent scourge of the killing of councillors after 2 were murdered within a week. An IFP councillor from the Amajuba district municipality was shot dead outside his house in Newcastle. And that was a week after an ANC ward councillor was murdered in Hammersdale. I also saw, and I mentioned this yesterday on the show, there was an ANC councillor who had her house shot up by assassins the other day. So, and that was in East London, which, we used to always have political violence in KZN, but it really does look like it's now firmly established in a lot of the country outside of its traditional areas, so to speak. So I guess I'll start with you, Michael. Firstly, your thoughts on this, but really this does seem to be, I think this is completely ridiculous because this is very much fixing the symptom, not the problem kind of thing. I really don't think councillors, what's the alternative if you don't
exactly.
If someone gets murdered, do you not have a councillor then?
Sure. Yeah. To suspend democracy because democracy hasn't delivered the solution. It's really not. It's not going to work. And it's it's a rule of law issue. As you say, it's one of quite long standing. The IRR, in the person of Gareth van Onselen, in fact, wrote a very, very fine report. Sorry, you may need to remind me of when exactly. I think it was about 2018.
Yeah, or 2019,
or
somewhere around there.
Yeah. In which he did a thorough job of researching the scale of the issue at that point, but also warned that it's simply a matter of time before it spread, before it began to impact on governance and so on. And this is essentially what we're seeing. It's really quite a nasty thing when a party that presumably depends on the political process, says we've got to suspend the political process because it's too dangerous. So it's a worrying thing, and it's a reflection of policing failure. I don't really know enough about this, but I remember in Gareth's report he made mention of the fact that the ANC had a number of commissions look into this problem, but one of the problems was following up on the recommendations, and the party being insufficiently exercised to actually tackle this problem within itself, and to kind of beat off the risk. But yeah, I mean, isn't it awful that you want to get a job in politics, so you kill the guy who you hope to replace? It's it's kind of straight line to an awful kind of power politics, I guess.
No, exactly. And it seems that a lot of the time, while there definitely is occasionally some assassination of rival political party members, that a lot of the murder is being driven by internal party politics. Although I do see the NFP tries to downplay that aspect in their media statement here. They also said that killing of councillors should be treated as treasonous. Therefore, their safety should be prioritized, as one councillor killed is a huge setback in terms of service delivery.
Yeah.
Now, I don't think it needs to be called treasonous, because we already have a rule that you can't kill ward councillors. It's called an anti-murder rule. Sarah? Please, your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I'm not sure if they've thought through the proposition, because as you say, it's a fairly, what happens when eventually you run out of councillors? Everyone's been shot to death, and there's one man standing. I mean, you don't have a council. It's a terrible situation, because it is about the follow through. I mean, if you've had commissions of inquiry into it, the logical result has to be that the police and the prosecutorial services have got to follow that up. I don't think we know from other areas of policing the capacity isn't there. The state of policing is appalling. I mean, we have a pretty terrible Minister of Police. The Commissioner of Police shouldn't be in the job anymore, and there are probably a number of deputies that shouldn't be in the job anymore. And the most crucial function that a government can perform is to protect its citizens. I suspect insofar as you're looking at killing for the sake of trying to get a position, which it seems like it might be a little risky, but it also explains why it's maybe more internecine than we imagine. Because then they're more likely to step into the shoes of somebody else. But it's given all the constraints, it's a dreadful situation. But councillors are not, as you say, Nick, are not entitled to any specific extra protection that the rest of us don't get. It's at some point that, as Gareth has sort of spelt out, the point tipped from being an occasional thing to becoming almost a modus operandi. And unless the police can crack open some of these, properly crack open some of these assassinations, I think some of the smaller parties might find that no one's prepared to stand for them. I mean, literally stand. And so they may not be able to field candidates. The bigger parties always will, unless it really becomes, genocidal. But it's right. I don't see the solution. Certainly doesn't lie in not solving the by-elections, because, I mean, as it is, service delivery is pretty dire. Having no one provide any service delivery is even more dire, if that's possible.
Right. It's a continuing problem of the, I guess you could call it, the criminalization of the political class, because if everyone who's a politician is getting shot, then the only people who are going to stand are those real tough hombres who are probably used to shooting and getting shot at on a regular basis. But, once again, this is another one of those, we've got a smaller problem, which is political violence, and then we've got the larger problem that underpins it, and it underpins so much of what's going on in the country right now, and that is the ineffectiveness of the police force, the inability of the police force to do what it needs to do. and that is protect the lives of citizens. Any final thoughts, Michael?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that it immediately reminds me of, or sets up an association with in my mind, is the threats or the risks that construction companies face when thugs threaten them with all kinds of violence if they don't employ certain people or do certain things. And that, I mean, I don't know if anyone's really done a thorough study of that, but I think that is a very, very dangerous thing also. Yeah. It's probably costing the economy hundreds of millions of rands, and sentiment and all the rest of it. It's just a hugely debilitating thing. And again, unless the cops are really tackling it, getting to the root of it fearlessly and so on, without paying any heed to all the interests that must be at stake, it's just going to get worse and worse.
I see one of our listeners here says that the ANC has been murdering for political benefit since its inception, with a peak between the 80s and 90s, old dog, old tricks. And I think there's obviously a lot of truth in that. Of course, our scholar Anthea Jeffrey wrote a book about ANC and political violence in the 80s and 90s called The People's War. But I think it's worth noting that we did definitely have a lull in political violence in the sort of late 2000s, early 2010s, and it is re-emerging now. And I suspect that the root cause of that is not only a more competitive politics, but also a weaker police force. As Jesse reminds me in the comments, it's time to do YouTube reminders. So please, if you do enjoy our content, please like our videos, please comment on them, and please subscribe to them. Subscribe to us, or if you're listening to us on the podcast app, please leave us a review. We do like to hear what you say. And that really does help us to spread our message, the great tendrils of the RRR, far and wide, and hopefully change the climate of ideas in South Africa, which is ultimately what we're trying to do here. One half an hour podcast at a time. With that out of the way, let us move on to our next story. And this is, we often are accused of being very gloomy and doomy on the show. There's definitely truth to that. But I think here's a really great story that I saw. It was labeled on News 24 as a feel-good story, and it certainly is. And this is the story of a 29-year-old Eastern Cape school principal, very recently promoted, who managed to change his rural school that he works in from having a matric pass rate of 28% in 2018 to 88.6% in 2021. Abonga Madaze was started as a teacher in this small rural school in the Eastern Cape in 2019, and he was a maths and science teacher. Now, when he arrived at the school had a 0% pass rate for maths and science, and basically he was asked to turn things around. And he managed to do so pretty quickly. He was made the head of the maths and science department. I suspect there are not that many teachers there because this is a very small school. It only has, I think, 35 matrics writing. And he managed to boost the pass rate to 35% and the science rate to 43% in 1 year. And overall, the school then went up to a 45% pass rate. With that great success out of the way, he was immediately appointed to be acting principal at the time. And very quickly, after introducing morning and evening classes, as well as revision over the weekends, the school's pass rate shot up very quickly. So like I said, it's a very small school. It only has 35 candidates. And that's presumably because a lot of people, they either don't send their kids to school in the area, or they send them to somewhere else because, what's the point of sending your child to a school where the pass rate is so low? Ever since he's managed to boost the pass rate, though, the number of students at the school has increased by quite a lot. He was, of course, praised by the MEC for Education in the Eastern Cape, who I think is not very used to being able to celebrate a genuine win. And so they were very happy about that. His origins are that he managed to get he was raised by a single parent with his siblings and cousins, a story that's very common for a lot of South Africans. But he managed to get a good score in high school, and he went on to be funded in university by the National Financial Aid Scheme, NSFAS, and a teaching bursary. And from that, he then became a qualified maths and science teacher and has gone on to transform the school that he works at. So a fantastic story. And I think what it really shows, Sara, is that with the right teachers and the right leadership, you can do an enormous amount to turn around a school. What do you make of this?
No, it's a fantastic story, and it does exactly that. I mean, I've always gone by the mantra that it's about management. Your management's good, there are limitless possibilities. If your management's poor, delivery is going to be very poor. And we've had a number of examples of schools in, I suppose one would call province, largely rural schools, poor results, if any. And what's come out is that it has been about having a central figure, the principal, who holds discipline over the staff and the children, but it's usually quite strict, but it's also very encouraging and life affirming, and they get extraordinary results. And I remember an interview with a principal a few years ago who said that nothing, classrooms, books, etc., nothing matters as much as dedicated teaching. And that is the absence of dedicated teaching is a problem in the society. Our colleague John Kane Berman did a report, did research on schools, on a number of schools that fitted this profile. They were poor schools that had achieved extraordinary results, on a par with fully funded, properly maintained public schools. And his report came out with exactly the same thing. It was about taking control, imposing discipline, making kids come to school on Saturdays if necessary, and what I think, and also getting the parents on board. That's from my own experience is not easy at all. But I mean, what is probably even more impressive than the very fact of the maths results he's getting is that he if he's dealing with high school kids and the maths results were virtually null, he would have to work against probably 10 years of very inadequate, if any, maths education. So that implies that something huge. And I think principals like him should be lauded. Their example needs to be studied. Of course, you need the various departments of education to act on teachers who perform badly. Let me just say perform badly. I mean, and of course, with SATU being a very dominant presence as a trade union, not enough teachers are appropriately disciplined, and by that I mean probably fired. But these cases of this young principal and other principals who've really achieved results against all odds, I think as much should be made of them in the media as possible.
What's also quite interesting about this story is that one of the inspirations is his mother, who lost her job in 2002, but still managed to make sure that her kids, especially him, went to school and got a proper education. And also he had a maths teacher from Ghana, who a lot of the students didn't really like or understand because he had a heavy accent. But Madze was very keen on this teacher, thought that he was really inspirational, and that kind of inspired him to get into education. So what Sara has said, I think, is really important. Really, I think what this story shows, Michael, is that there are some really great people in the system. Still, despite all the reasons why why we wouldn't see excellence in the public education system, there are still people out there who really want to change the way things are done. And that what policy needs to do is make it so that these people are empowered and those who stand in the way of good education are disempowered. Your thoughts?
Right. That very interesting report that John Kane Berman did was in, I think, 18th of May 2018. I highly recommend listeners to have a look at it. It's a really very interesting report. He looked at a range of schools, essentially top performing schools in Gauteng, and covered everything from no fee, very poor, no fee township schools, all the way through to independent fee-paying schools where you would expect to get much better results. And in fact, the distinction was much less obvious than one would have imagined. And the report brings out very detailed, speaks to the principals, speaks to parents and teachers and so on, brings out the very thing that that Sara mentioned, that it comes down to the quality of the teaching. And there's just this line in the report which I think is really very powerful for me. John, in his conclusion, writes that the real distinction is not, in fact, between private operators or owned schools owned by private investors, as opposed to poor schools run by the government. The real distinction, as we've already noted, is not between public and independent schools, but between good and bad schools, and especially good and bad public schools. And that's very interesting. It reminds me of years ago, probably in the 90s, when there was a great deal of attention in the newspapers. I was working as a newspaper journalist then. A great deal of attention given in quite a trite sort of stereotypical way, I suppose, looking at South Africa and the great divide between the haves and the have-nots. It was obviously a theme of all the politics at the time, and Nelson Mandela was the great bridge between the two. But nevertheless, it was part of the role of journalism to bring this out and look at it, to examine it, ask questions about it, and present the evidence of the society that needed fixing. And we had, on this particular occasion, for some reason, there was a big focus on schooling, and the paper ran 2 photographs on the front page with the intentional juxtaposition to suggest have and have not. And the one photograph was of a man teaching this rapt class of little children under a tree, and he had a kind of makeshift blackboard up against the tree, and there they all were. They were all kind of neatly in their little rows with all of their books, and he was giving a class. And the photograph next door was a similarly rapt class, very attentive, but clearly very well-heeled, beautifully turned out kids in a private school, wonderfully equipped classroom with overhead projectors and whiteboards and all the rest of it. And through the windows, you could see the beautiful trees and the gardens and playing fields and so on. And this was to intended to, as I say, juxtapose the good and the bad, or the problem and the solution, or the privilege and the vast mass of neglected people. And I had a huge row both with the reporter who did the story and also with the editor in our conference, because I said what we are doing is actually reflecting, these photographs, I said, reflect exactly the same thing. You're pathologizing the fact that a teacher who is teaching under a tree is somehow lesser than a teacher who has all the equipment and the beautiful school and so on. What we really need to be looking at is a different thing. It's a qualitative thing, but what we're actually showing is potentially the same thing. A good teacher teaching his class, and they're sitting down and they're learning, and that's got to be the start. And the image itself is not, in fact, a distinction so much as an illustration of what teaching is really all about. A teacher present in the class, and getting little children to learn things. And of course, maybe I was simplifying it, but I did feel very strongly at that time that we tended to overlook exactly the thing that Sara said, that you don't need the books and the library and the computers. They're all wonderful to have, but if you don't have that committed teacher, really devoted to his or her job and getting it done properly and involving the kids, and like this headmaster, getting them clearly excited about what he remembered being excited about, which is learning and succeeding. If you don't have that, none of the rest are going to make any impact. Sorry, I went on rather long.
No, that's a good point to make. If resources were all there was to education, then South Africa would have the best education system in Africa, which it doesn't.
There we go. Yeah.
And I think that's a really good point to remember.
Yeah.
All right. So we've in our last sort of 5 minutes or so, let's talk a little bit about our third story, which is the current interview process with the Chief Justices. So now we are without a Chief Justice. and we're looking to get a new one. There's a couple of candidates. I think there's 4. I think I'm correct in saying. I think their interviews are currently underway as we speak. And Sara, I just want your sort of general thoughts on the process and maybe who you would prefer as the next Chief Justice.
Yeah, as you say, it's too soon to really comment on what the judges have said in their interviews. The little impression I have at the moment is that the first interview, Justice Madlanga, Constitutional Court Justice, there don't seem to be any idiotic comments or questions coming from the Judicial Services Commission, but who knows, that may still happen. But I don't think so. I think this is kind of almost seen as too serious to misbehave in. He made an interesting comment. I just was struck by it. He noted that for a considerable number of years there has not been a white judge on the Constitutional Court. I think it's 12 years. I may be wrong. I don't think it's that long, but it's a number of years. But they do have to have regard to diversity. And I assume what he meant is, obviously, is putting in place black judges. And I thought, but this makes no sense. We have a court that has been entirely black for a number of years. The majority of the population is black. The diversity would be in putting in place a white judge, or at least letting a white candidate compete for the position. And we know how all the things that have gone down in on that score towards the end of last year. The other judges are the acting Chief Justice himself, Ray Zondo, and I don't think he's a particularly sort of overwhelming. I don't think he's a particularly overwhelming justice, Zondo, but I think the 3.5 years on the commission and having to face the extraordinary amount of the underbelly of fraud, corruption, and state capture in South Africa might have made him a more practical judge who will look at things perhaps a little more in depth, having understood a whole lot of things he might not have been exposed to before. Dunstan Malambo is the sorry, I forget his title, but essentially he's the head justice of the Gauteng Northern South Division. Judge President. Sorry, they keep on, all these. And he's robust, and apparently, according to judges I've spoken to, he runs a very much tighter ship than his predecessors administratively, and he doesn't take nonsense. He's also been fairly robust in a number of his recent decisions. Probably what goes against him is that he's declared himself to be a transformationist, a transformist judge, which doesn't always end up having the optimum results in judgments. But he could certainly cope with the position. And the last one is Mandisa Meyer, who's the head of the SCA, the Supreme Court of Appeals. I don't know very much about her. The Supreme Court of Appeals does seem to be fairly consistent in the sense of it makes very well-considered judgments, whether one necessarily agrees with the actual judgments themselves, but well-considered judgments. But often those judgments are overturned by the Constitutional Court on a sort of transformation basis, and that's where the concern comes in. To what extent, she hasn't been there for all that long, but to what extent she has contributed to that and would contribute to a court, I'm really not sure. I think we'll have to see the outcome of the actual interviews and see if anything comes from that. But I certainly think Malambo would be strong. Madlanga, I just don't know personally, but he's come out with some fairly strong, hard-hitting judgments. So it's certainly an indication of some level of clear thought and independent thought.
In about 30 seconds or so, Michael, your thoughts on the Chief Justice?
Quite a difficult one, as Sara says. Often I think judges behave differently when they're given different positions or higher positions. Certainly, I think their careers inform change in their perception of their role in society and so on. So we might well see some of that. I see Maya is credited as having run an especially efficient court. Very few delays, quite swift decision making, which is quite untrue of some of the high courts and even the constitutional court to some extent. But yeah, certainly it looks like we have a fairly strong list of candidates. They all seem to have an element of spine and backbone and willingness to stand up to the powerful. So that all in all, to the extent that we can't really know much more than that, it's a pretty good list, I think.
Yes, could be much worse. Anyway, that's all the time we have for today. So thank you very much. Please support the Institute of Race Relations by SMSing your name to 32823 and read the Daily Friend, dailyfriend.co.za. You can check out our opinion pieces there and some occasional news stories. But that's all the time we have for today. So thank you very much. And we will see you tomorrow on the Daily Friend Show. Cheers, everyone.